families and genetic manipulation in your region of space. Amongst advanced nations, the family unit as you know it is still practiced in many places and is always maintained amongst ruling classes. In more primitive worlds, it is certainly nature's pattern. But amongst more advanced nations who rely upon technology and who have a great interest in genetics, the situation begins to change. Family units and family clans leading to greater tribal units is certainly the evolutionary pattern for intelligent life to evolve. This pattern is followed unless it is interrupted or controlled in some way by external forces. Over a very long period of time, the emphasis on genetics and genetic control has been extremely widespread, with results that have been both beneficial and at times catastrophic. It is certainly catastrophic for those who are bred for certain purposes. This has generated both practical and ethical issues, which vary between organizations and races. The family unit in more progressive and technological societies has at times been maintained all the way up to the ruling classes. But, in general, to maintain stability and security, unfortunate collective breeding has been generated and cultivated to a very high degree. Worker classes, classes of beings who have specializations, military classes and other groups have been the focus of collective breeding, except in nations where it is considered unethical and impractical. From the human viewpoint, collective breeding is horrific, even though at this moment there is experimentation with genetic manipulation under the guise of improving the health and welfare of people. But this represents a seduction of power and a complete undermining of the reality and the potential of human freedom and creativity. Races who are involved in exploration and the manipulation of worlds such as yours rely upon genetic breeding. The races that they breed are bred for certain purposes and are often deprived of any individualistic qualities, even to the extent that they have no compassion for one another. They are inbred, and their natural tendencies towards self-preservation are also limited. The problem of collective breeding coincides with the development of large technological nations that must exert uniformity and control, particularly if they have foreign establishments. To have disorder amongst the population is always a potential and a constant problem, and this problem has in many places been addressed through an emphasis on collective breeding. But collective breeding has its own hazards, for it is extremely difficult to create the desired results with absolute assurance. There have been cases even in your local districts where classes of bred individuals have turned against their masters, destroying the infrastructure that they were meant to serve. Unable then to fend for themselves because they were not designed for this, they led to great disorder and had to be destroyed. It is an imperfect science. Even though it has been cultivated to a very, very fine degree of specificity, it is still an imperfect C67 For you cannot create what God has created, and you cannot completely manipulate what God has created. A biological entity has other qualities that are beyond the control of genetic manipulation. So amongst more ethical races, collective breeding has been avoided because it is unethical, because it destroys the capabilities of the individual, and because its end results often prove to be unpredictable and even chaotic. Therefore, advanced ethical nations do not engage in this practice. Yet there are many advanced nations who do not have these ethics and who have made their worker classes function according to very specific genetic designs. They serve those above them who sustain a normal and natural family pattern. Yet this is hazardous, for you cannot control completely the minds and perceptions of those who have come into life, even through the mechanism of collective breeding. The potential for disunity and disloyalty is always there. Genetic manipulation is a power, but it is a hazardous power. If it is taken too far, if it is employed against the well-being of society itself, then it becomes a great hazard. It is one of the problems of assuming technological power and control, and represents the attempt to establish stability and security without an emphasis on individual freedom. In those races who have engaged in this practice to a high degree, even their ruling classes have become like prisoners, surrounded by a vast army of bred individuals whom they must watch constantly, fearing for their own lives and well-being should any abnormalities or other influences enter into these controlled populations. That is why the notion of individual freedom and the expressions of individual freedom, such as art, music and other creative expressions, are seen as a threat or a danger to a nation that relies upon collective breeding and upon a vast population of genetically designed individuals. For these notions and expressions might stimulate something in these breed individuals, an interest, a fascination and so forth. Even the simplest expression of individual freedom or pleasure could be seen as a danger to the hierarchy who controls them. It is an interesting phenomenon that the more one attempts to exert control, the more vulnerable one becomes. There is no state of absolute control and security. Though it is needed to a certain extent to maintain the stability, the survival and the well-being of a nation and a society, if it is taken to extremes, it produces hazards of its own. God has created the individual to be creative and expressive. If there is an attempt to override this with genetic conditioning, political oppression or social designation, it creates a fundamental conflict within the individual. Here there is always the potential that the individual will turn against its genetic design, will turn against its social designation, and will turn against those who have established its functions in society. Over the course of a very long time, many experiments have been done to attempt to design a hierarchical system of functionality. In very small groups, such as economic collectives, it has been achieved with a certain degree of success. But in larger established societies, it has become more difficult to achieve. If groups with different genetic designations intermingle with one another, the results can be unpredictable. In larger societies, it is very difficult to separate one population from another entirely. They can stimulate each other in certain ways beyond the predictions and the calculations of their genetic designs. This is one of the reasons why free nations avoid contact with large nations or rely upon collective breeding and genetic design. It is one of the reasons, likewise, that these large nations avoid contact with free nations, where individual expression and the demonstration of individual creativity would be seen as a danger to the social order by these larger civilizations. It is a problem certainly in nations that have become entirely secular, where there is no understanding of the spiritual nature of the individual or of the power and presence of knowledge, the deeper spiritual intelligence within the individual. When nations and civilizations become entirely secular, they lose awareness of the greatest power and potential within the individual. Though they may seek to control the design and functionality of an individual through genetic engineering and social function, they cannot erase completely the deeper spiritual reality within the individual. This represents one of the great problems facing large, advanced technological societies. It is one of the problems that limits the size of societies and empires. Very large empires are inherently unstable, and the problem of control becomes such that they tend to collapse, either at their perimeters or at their very centers. If you are going to create a society where individuals function like machines, then you have to function like a machine. And machines only function along certain parameters. Outside of those parameters, their nature becomes highly unpredictable. For a biological entity, this will always be the case. In your local neighborhood, amongst those races whom you may encounter, there is evidence of collective breeding, particularly amongst economic collectives that carry on local trade and are also involved in illegal trade as well. In larger societies, collective breeding is usually kept to a minimum, for it has proven too difficult to manipulate over time. Yet nations vary from one another in what they create and in their ethical emphasis. Should you ever have encounters with trading nations in your region, you will see the evidence of collective breeding. You will see it expressed in extreme forms, and you will see the exertion of genetic emphasis in general populations, which will tend to be very uniform in their appearance and behavior. It is a danger that humanity will have to face because this kind of genetic manipulation is a seduction. It is a seduction of power. Though it may seem to have an innocent purpose at the outset and certain practical applications, the seduction of power is there nonetheless. Such ideas are now being discovered in the human family. Much of this information has been introduced by those races who are visiting and intervening in the world today. It is in their interest that humanity would develop and use this technology. For economic collectives have great difficulty dealing with nations of relatively free individuals.